Good morning, Cornerstone. This morning we're going to be looking at one of the most challenging or confusing passages in the New Testament. And what we're going to be looking at today is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 22. And let me just read that to get us started, and then we're going to get into that a little bit more. Today is going to be a little more specific. It's going to be a deep dive into what this specific doctrine is, because it's so challenging. I want people to be able to go away with some kind of a sense at my best guess. But before we even read the scripture, I want to just point out that Martin Luther had this to say about this particular passage. A wonderful text is this, and a more obscure passage perhaps than any other in the New Testament, so that I do not know for a certainty just what Peter means. So as we go in today, I'm just letting you know ahead of time, there's a great amount of humility. I'm not going to present today's message with any kind of hubris that I have absolute certainty on this particular interpretation. I have done a ton of research this week looking at it and trying to understand this from a scholarly standpoint, and I think I have a clearer picture that I want to present. But let's go ahead and get into the Word of God, and it says this. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Here's where it gets interesting. In which he went and proclaimed or preached to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. We, by nature, we have been created with the capacity and the ability and we've been built in such a way, our minds have been created in such a way that we are always looking for patterns. This is why, if you listen to music, we have this verse, chorus, bridge, chorus kind of pattern in music. In fact, in the 20th century, modern composers began to tire of the minor, major chord structure and began to form different kinds of musical structures. And one of them, whose name was Schoenberg, he actually created what now is called atonality. And he said, look, we shouldn't have, we've got all these different notes. We shouldn't have a preference for a major scale or a minor scale. We should just appreciate the notes independently. But even if you listen to his music, or if you listen to other 20th century composers' music, there is still patterns within the music. It's what it makes the music really brilliant. There sometimes are rhythmical patterns. Sometimes it's a distance between the notes. And those patterns, those repeated patterns, is what our ears are trained to listen for. And we are, as humans, we're trained to look for those kind of patterns. And we do that when we approach the scripture. We do that when we approach the Bible. And what becomes challenging sometimes is when we approach scripture, we are looking for these patterns, and we bring to the table presuppositions, or we bring to the table ideas that sometimes connect dots that aren't there. So for example, have you ever looked up in the clouds and seen a face, or seen an object, seen a horse or some other thing represented in the clouds, and went, wow, that's good. That's because we're patterned people. We're looking for ways of understanding the world around us. But we recognize when we look at the clouds that that's not really a human face. There isn't really a horse in the clouds. And sometimes that happens when we look at scripture. Sometimes we come to the Bible, we come to the text of scripture, and we say, I have to understand this. I want so badly to understand this. And so the question becomes, why in the world is this weird, strange passage in 1 Peter? What is he trying to do? And I think there are patterns there that we can draw from, and there are things that we can look for in the greater text. And let's remember, first of all, that the book of Peter is written to encourage Christians. It's a handbook for how Christians respond to hardship. And so if that is the case, and then we understand also contextually what he's been talking about, which is, if you remember, it's being subject to unjust human authorities. It's being subject to unfair or unjust human masters. It's wives being subject to imperfect husbands. Be subject, be subject, be subject. And then we're told we do this because we're going to model our lives after Christ, who has subjected himself to ultimately, well, we see it in verse 18. Christ also suffered once for sins, Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. Christ, who was righteous, who didn't deserve suffering, suffered for the unrighteous, those who did. And so we have a pattern that's emerging here. And we then get into this idea that's so complicated about what in the world is going on, where it says here, being put to death in the flesh, made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. There are three major theories on this, and I'm going to present the first two that I don't think are that I don't prefer, and then I'm going to present the one that I do. The first one is that this is talking about that Christ went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, that this is a metaphorical statement, that the spirits in prison are actually like contemporaries of Christ, or contemporaries of Peter, that Christ is going and he is preaching the gospel to people who are living in sin. And it's as simple as that. The second theory is this, that these references to the Old Testament, that there's what would be called typology going on, that Christ is actually going and preaching to the people of Noah's day. And that in the same way that baptism is a type of water rescue, like the ark was a type of water rescue, that what is happening here, what we're supposed to see here, is that when Noah preached to his fellow humans at that day, that he was a type of Jesus, that he was a type of Christ, that he was preaching good news to those people, and that there is a Christ type in Noah. There's all kinds of problems with that. There's challenges with that. I'm not going to get into everything, but I don't really buy that one, which leaves the third option on the table, which is that we read it at face value, that literally Christ is going somewhere and preaching or teaching or proclaiming something to spirits in prison. If we're going to understand it in a literal sense, there are several different interpretations of what that means literally. Some people understand this to be like a purgatory. This is going to be the Catholic understanding of that. I don't buy that one. The other possibility is that it is some kind of proclamation to, like, almost a universalist kind of understanding where people who have died get a second chance. And I don't really buy that one either. I think what is actually being said is something quite different. And it comes down to a couple of key phrases and how we understand them. And the first one is spirits, and the second one is preached. Spirits is a word that is almost always used not to describe human spirits. There's one exception in Hebrews, but even that is a qualified thing where it makes it clear that it's humans. Spirits is usually a word that is restricted or reserved for supernatural spirits. So it's possible that what Christ is doing here is he's going to spirits who are in prison, meaning fallen angelic spirits. Now, I I recognize that our pattern seekers are the things that we want to find in our head. We look at this and we say, spirits, I don't see that. That's not what my brain initially comes to. And that's fair because the translators have done a good job bringing out the words in the Greek that are transliterated. Like they're trying to say, this is what the Greek says and give it to us. But culturally, we don't understand. We're not coming to the table with the same set of tools as Peter's readers came to the table with. And we don't understand that Peter's readers would have looked at spirits and understood that it probably meant a supernatural being. We may not even be comfortable with the idea of supernatural beings. And so we just naturally fall into the idea that spirit is like soul, a human soul. But I don't think that's what it's saying. I think it's talking about supernatural beings. The second thing is, what does this word preached mean? And the word preached usually, contextually, means preached good news. And so when we see that word preached, or proclaimed, we typically associate that with the euangelion, the good news of the gospel, that a victory has been won, and that the good news to those spirits would be, hey, we're going to offer to you salvation. However, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Peter would have recognized that his listeners, his readers, the people who knew him would have been familiar with that word preached also being a word that would have some negative connotation. So take, for example, the story of Jonah. Jonah goes and preaches to the city of Nineveh and says, your judgment is coming. It's the same word. And so this proclamation that is being made by Christ here may actually be a proclamation to fallen supernatural beings, fallen spirits, about the final victory of Christ. Now, why is this important? Because the question is, we have this bigger theme. We're looking for these bigger patterns. We're trying to understand this whole passage in context of Peter and the purpose of Peter. And why did he write this letter? Why did he write a letter to show Christians how to handle or interact with hardship? Why would he have written a letter that had to do with this idea almost that seems at first glance, at least to the 21st century American, that it's talking about like purgatory or second chances to dead souls? I would suggest it actually isn't saying that at all. It's actually, it needs to be the vision or the picture that we would have is this is Christ on a victory lap. You ever seen a victory lap when a runner has been racing and he's run his heart out and he wins the race, and what does he do? Sometimes they just collapse, which is probably what I would do. But sometimes when these runners win, they'll drape their flag around their shoulders and they'll throw their hands up and they'll run another lap. And they will, because they are celebrating the victory. And this is, I think, the best understanding of 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 22. Because what Peter is doing is he's been talking about Christ's suffering, and he's giving us other ways of looking at it. He's giving us variations on that. And he's saying Christ suffered, but ultimately Christ subjected himself to unjust human institutions. Christ subjected himself to unfair human masters. Christ subjected himself even unto death, verse 18. But in the end, Christ was victorious. Be subject, be subject, be subject. But what does verse 22 say at the end? That Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, spiritual beings, authorities. We see this in other places in the New Testament, spiritual authorities, another spiritual word, and powers having been subjected to him. The pattern here appears to be one where Christ has been victorious. And the way we understand this passage is through that lens, through that expectation. And what we're to take away from it ultimately is hope. If we even just back up a little bit, it says, now who, in verse 13, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Rhetorical question. Because what happens ultimately is that these Christians are being harmed for doing the good things, for being righteous, for being good people. Where is the hope in that? If we're going to be persecuted for doing good, where is the hope? The hope is that Christ, who also was submitted to persecution, to suffering, that ultimately he did not finish at a place where he was subject to that injustice, but that he was vindicated through being placed at the right hand of his Father in heaven, and that all powers and angels and authorities have been subjected to him, and that we also triumph because of Christ's victory. That's the hope. That's the reason for 1 Peter chapter 3, 18 through 22, is that in our lives, as we sit around and we're like, where's the hope in this? What do I have to look forward to in what's going on around me? As we try to understand the world that we see around us, that ultimately Christ will be victorious over all things. Love you guys, and we'll talk to you soon.